True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
So Carol Montecalvo was a devoted Christian, and she married her prison pen pal. Once he was released, they seemed happy. But on the evening of March 31st, 1988, Carol and her husband Dan were shot. Dan survived. Carol was killed. After Carol's death, Dan told police that, on the night of the shooting, he and Carol went for a walk together around the neighborhood. And when they returned to the house, Carol was shot to death by an intruder. Dan also suffered a non-life-threatening gunshot wound. So join us at the quiet end for Death of a Prison Bride. Dan claimed that he found his wife bleeding on the floor of their home that night. And evidence in the Montecalvo's home seemed to support a burglary gone wrong. That is, until it didn't. Investigators became suspicious of Dan when they learned of his extensive criminal past, his large gambling debts, and the $600,000 in life insurance that he held on Carol's life. So, did Dan find God? Or did Carol just find herself an evil guy? That's what we'll figure out today, hopefully.
I got it figured out already.
All right, Mr. Smarty Pants, what are we having for beer then?
We're having a great one from Firestone Walker Brewing Company in Paso Robles, California. It's Tequila Barrel Sunrise. This is an American barley wine, 11% alcohol by volume. So we will, of course, be sharing this with all our buddies. The beer's dark amber, tiny little beige head, great aroma, tequila, caramel, orange, vanilla, and taste follows the nose exactly. Tequila, caramel, orange, and vanilla. There's some late earthy hops that you can taste. Great sipping beer.
I am ready to sip. How about you?
Always ready to sip.
Okay, Dickie, open that up. Down here at the quiet end at last. I miss this place when I'm not here.
Yeah, nice to be here.
It really is. So why don't you start us out on this case? Tell us about Carol first, and then we'll kind of get into how she met this man and what he really was like.
Will do. So Carol Montecalvo was born Carol Tronconi. Her parents, Carmelo and Maria, were proud of their daughter, who was intelligent and extraordinarily kind. As an adult, Carol was strong and educated, but she was known to be very naive when it came to men and relationships. It seemed like Carol was interested only in men who were a challenge for her, men whose problems she hoped to solve with her consistent love and selfless help.
So I've known plenty of women that are like this, and I might even say there was a time where I was a little bit like that. So it's not uncommon for women to fall into that trap, and I'd say especially with Carol's generation.
Yeah. Now, in spite of Carol's propensity to take in needy men, Carol's parents and siblings never imagined that she would marry a man like Dan Montecalvo.
No. Poor people.
Probably
they
not.
did not. No, they just weren't totally thrilled.
This guy had never had a steady job. He'd been in trouble with the law. Obviously, he was in prison. And he was a serial cheater. So he was everything that Carol's father was not.
Right. So her father, Carmelo, was someone his family could really rely on. You know, he wasn't perfect, of course, though. He met Carol's mother during the Great Depression when they were both in their 20s. And Carmelo, or Mel as his friends called him, was the youngest child in an Italian farming family in Buffalo, New York. The Depression was especially hard for the farmers who lived in Mel's neighborhood. So long after his older siblings had moved away, Mel stayed on. He helped his parents with the farm, so this is quite commendable. But it was really the expectation. So he was a handsome guy, nearly 6 foot tall and well built, and he was accustomed to doing hard physical work. In fact, Mel dreamed of having a farm of his own one day. But then by the time he married Maria, the Depression had made his dream pretty much impossible, because by then his parents had been forced to sell their farm, and Mel had no money to buy land of his own. Because he had been farming while most of his friends went off to school, Mel was left looking for a job without even having a high school diploma. Now, Maria had earned her college degree, and it was a teaching degree. She earned that back when she was single. But then, like many other educated women of that time, she gave up the idea of having a career when she married Mel. And Mel would really have it no other way. But he did struggle to provide for them by working long hours as a machinist and as a floor sander. So for a few years, he and his brother tried to make a living running their own hardware store. But the economy was not on their side, so over and over again, Mel found himself frustrated in his job search. And it was mostly because he just lacked education. But he was persistent, and that did finally pay off when he was hired by their local telephone company as a maintenance worker. This job had union benefits and a high-paying salary, and no one could have been more appreciative of this. So Mel promised himself that his children would have every opportunity to go to college, regardless of any sacrifices that he might have to make. He was determined in this, which isn't unusual. I think a lot of immigrants from Europe that came over really just wanted to provide a better life for their family.
Exactly.
I'm sure it's true of all immigrants, basically. That's why most people come to the country.
Yeah, they're looking to improve.
Yeah, so that's what happened with him.
So the Troncones lived in a working-class neighborhood in a popular Italian neighborhood of Buffalo. That's where they had their first child, Rosanna. Mel was not happy bringing his new baby girl home to a neighborhood of working-class people because he believed his children deserved better. So during the next several years, he worked overtime, saving enough money so that 4 years later, shortly after the birth of their second daughter, Carol, the family could afford to move. By then, Mel's salary from the telephone company was better than many professionals. Their new home was in an upper-class area where their neighbors were doctors, lawyers, business executives, and so on. Now, Mel convinced his family that they were a class above the people in their old neighborhood, so they would have no trouble feeling comfortable in the new neighborhood.
And that really did seem to work out. But this lifestyle also meant that Rosanna and Carol were sheltered and really just unaware of the pitfalls in life. In their years growing up, the girls had no friends from single-parent homes, and they didn't know anyone who was on welfare. They grew up believing that all people were essentially good and that life was fair. So, a lot to learn there.
No kidding.
Yeah. So as a child, Carol was more difficult than her older sister. It's not that she was disobedient, but she had an appetite for adventure. So if Maria didn't keep an eye on her, she might just wander off to the nearby bus stop or take a walk in the city on her own. So the summer between kindergarten and first grade, Carol brought home a boy. She held his hand and proudly introduced him as her boyfriend. Rosanna, who was 4 years older, was still disgusted by the thought of holding a boy's hand. She'd never brought a boy home. So Carol was 8 when her brother John was born. So now there's 3 kids, and the 2 girls helped their mother with the new baby, and then the 3 siblings grew very close. Carol became quite popular in school, and eventually she and her friends started a club that held after-school meetings, and they played games at each other's houses. So as soon as the other children saw Carol walking along the street, they'd run out to meet her. At 13, she was voted class queen, and that was at the 8th grade dance, and Mel and Maria were proud of their daughter's popularity. So by the time Carol entered high school, she was very bright, very pretty, and really expected things to go her way in life because so far they had.
Well, like you said before, she'll learn.
Unfortunately, we all have to, right? And that's what would happen. But still during her high school years, she excelled at ice skating, downhill skiing, and tennis. And she was also quite exceptional with her studies. What made Carol even more attractive was that she had so much confidence. She was never conceited and she was never a bully, but she wasn't timid or shy around anyone. So her father's lessons of you're just as good as anyone else definitely sunk in. So when Carol was 15, she became interested in an Italian boy who lived just 2 houses down the street. And at first, Carol thought the romance would just be short-lived because the boy was just kind of average, an average student, an average athlete, nothing exciting. And Carol believed that life was meant to be a challenge, so she was never attracted to boring or easygoing boys. But her opinion of this boy changed drastically when her father pulled her aside and told her that he disapproved of the boy. So that made the boy interesting, much more interesting, and her affection for him grew with every stern word of her father's. And the relationship ended up continuing for months. and Carol would sneak out at night to meet him. So Carol was 16 when her father found something else to worry about and became bored, so wasn't worried about the boyfriend anymore. And as soon as that happened, Carol broke up with him because the fun was gone.
Yeah, he served his purpose.
Right.
So when Carol was 18, her best friend Cindy was killed in a car accident. And after that horrible shock, Carol began paying more attention to her father's speeches about getting an education, almost as if she suddenly saw how fleeting life could be and decided to make the most of hers.
Well, I could see that. Growing up, I never had a friend of mine die. And I think that would be a rude awakening because when you are young, you do think that you're pretty much immortal and things are going to go your way, which certainly was the way Carol felt. So I can imagine that must be really hard to deal with as a young person, especially. Yeah.
So Carol enrolled at the State University of New York at Buffalo and began taking psychology courses. And for the next few years, Carol worked toward her dream of becoming a psychologist. In college, she was surrounded by people who were ambitious and came from good homes. Carol read about people in her psychology books who had not bonded to their parents or who lacked the ability to love or to be loved. Sometimes she would find herself attracted to the troubled people in her textbooks. She could think of nothing more rewarding than to use her knowledge to straighten out such people.
So, she had very good intentions in life. You have to admit to that. So Carol graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology, but then after a summer of unsuccessful job hunting, she became disillusioned. For all its textbook appeal, Carol was disappointed with the real-life world of psychology. She thought the therapists were too clinical and unfeeling, and she eventually decided she would change more lives if she became a teacher. So what she did was she re-enrolled at the university for 2 more years and got a master's degree in education. By that time, her sister Rosanna had also graduated with a master's degree in education, and she had married her college sweetheart. Their dad, Mel, was disappointed in Rosanna because he believed in children living at home for several years after their college graduation, and he thought that they would come back home and help with the expenses, the way that he had on his father's farm.
Yeah,
but of course, the girls had no inclination to do that.
Yeah, and he's just sort of changing his plans. What he wants is for them to grow up and get an education.
Right.
Which they both did.
They did.
One of them married, so maybe grandkids coming. But no, he's miffed because they're not coming back home to live with him.
Well, from everything I've read, Mel was not an easy man.
Doesn't sound like he was. It sounds like he was very rigid.
Yeah, and I mean, what woman is going to get a master's degree and then move back in with her mom and dad? And it's not like the family had a farm that they needed help with. The father was employed for a business.
Yeah, they had a house.
Yeah, but Mel was hard to please. I just get that idea.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So he hoped that Carol would move home once her education was completed because Roseanne didn't. But that was not part of Carol's plan either. And although she was still somewhat naive, she had become more liberated and she was an independent woman. And she was really looking forward to living on her own and starting her career. So you think he'd be satisfied. He's got the 2 daughters with master's degrees. That's wonderful. What else does he want?
He wants them back home living with him.
Yeah, that's right. So when Mel learned of Carol's plans, their relationship became strained. But while Mel was distant with Carol, Maria and Carol became close friends. The mother and daughter even took a trip together to California. Then just before graduating with her master's degree, Carol met a guy, Raj Rakia. And he was from India, and he was also earning his master's degree at the university. So Raj was the son of a doctor, and he came from a highly educated family, and he'd even traveled the world. He was the first man who had challenged and excited Carol in years. Long after their relationship had grown serious, Carol brought Raj home to meet her family, and her father was very cold to him. Then after Carol and Raj left her parents' house, Mel was angry, and he complained to his wife about Carol's choice of a man. "I will not have any daughter of mine dating some foreigner," that's what he said. And he also said that to Carol. Then he prohibited her from seeing him again, although she's very much an adult. And we know Carol a little bit, how her mind worked, so her father's disapproval only reinforced her choice of Raj. So that would totally backfire on Mel, and he should have known that.
Yeah, he sounds like a lot of people.
Yeah.
My daughter's not going to marry a foreigner.
Right. Which is crazy because his parents were Italian immigrants.
Right.
So does that make any sense?
A generation before.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
But anyway.
Yeah, he was a very close-minded man in many ways. So I guess it's fortunate that he wanted his daughters to be educated. It would have been worse if he wanted them to just get married and not have any life.
So Carol brought Raj back to the family home 2 more times. Each time Carol and Raj would hold hands and sit close together on the sofa. Mel was obviously unhappy with the couple's displays of affection, and the tension was made worse by Raj's silence. Carol's attempts to include him in family activities and conversations didn't work. How could they expect Raj to feel comfortable under Mel's obvious disdain? No one in her family was shocked when Carol disregarded her father's opinions and got engaged to Raj.
No, not at all. I mean, that's how Carol worked. It's how a lot of people work, and I kind of don't blame her.
No, she's kind of painted into a corner here.
She really is, yeah.
Now, upon hearing this announcement, Mel said that no one from the family would attend their wedding.
Can you believe it?
So they were married in a private ceremony. And as he said, no one was there from her side of the family.
No, and her mother and sister did want to come, but her mother was pretty much under Mel's thumb. He was the boss of that house. And then her sister, I think, had recently just had a baby or something, so she wasn't able to make the trip.
Yeah.
So although Carol had always been a very pretty girl, she was always battling her weight. She dropped down to 110 pounds for her wedding, and she looked happier than ever. Carol was truly in love with her new husband. After the wedding, Mel kept his distance from Raj, though, and because of the conflict, no one in the family was surprised when Raj and Carol moved away. They moved to Madison, Wisconsin later that same year, and Carol took a job in the counseling department of the University of Wisconsin. But then the accounting job that Raj had lined up fell through, and after a month of unemployment, he took a job at a firm that was nearly 200 miles away. So Carol was very upset that her husband would agree to work so far from home. But he told her that in his culture, men just did what they needed to do. And as he told her, the job would only be temporary until he could find something closer. So she agreed with it. What else was she going to do? And early on, Raj commuted. But eventually the strain began to wear on their relationship. And eventually he decided to get a small apartment just a few miles from his office. But still, Carol was willing to quit her job and move in with him. So for some reason, though, he dismissed that idea. He told her again that it was just a temporary arrangement. So disappointed and embarrassed by her inability to even be with her husband, Carol kept that news about Raj's apartment to herself. Although she was still close to her mom, the tension between Carol and her father only became worse when she moved to Wisconsin. Carol finally did confide in her mother about the separate living arrangements, though. After Raj's move, the couple visited each other on the weekends, and then it became like only once a month, so it was kind of, whittling down over time. And as often happens, when she was unhappy, Carol started gaining weight. She gained about 20 pounds. So she was also slowly realizing that Raj was either incapable of expressing emotions or he really didn't love her anymore, because he had become really cold and didn't really seem to want to spend time with her. Sometimes Carol would call Raj and spend hours begging him to come home to work on their marriage. She even told him, Italian Catholic families do not get divorced. Worse, a failed marriage would show her father that he'd been right about Raj from the beginning, and she definitely did not want that. But finally, as the marriage deteriorated to the point that they had become little more than strangers, Carol agreed to a divorce. Several months passed before she gathered enough courage, though, to call her mom and tell her that her marriage had failed. But then for the next 5 years after that, Carol was single, and she lived alone in Madison. Then during this time, she converted from Catholicism to non-denominational Christianity, and she got very deeply involved in her church there.
I tell you, if it took months before she could get courage to tell her parents what had happened,
yeah,
that's terrible.
It is terrible, but that was the situation.
Despite Carol's increasing devotion to God, she must have been very lonely after divorcing Raj. When her father learned about Carol's divorce, he gloated about being right.
Yeah, what a dick, huh?
Yeah.
Not a good dickie, a bad dick.
Yeah, I was thinking you'd say that. He also told Carol that he expected her to return to live at home.
Can you believe him?
When she stayed in Wisconsin, instead, her father became even more frustrated with his younger daughter. Involved with her own life, Carol prayed for her father's forgiveness.
But there's really nothing for him to forgive. What did she do wrong?
I know.
She got her degree, she moved away, she got married, so what? She's living her life.
And she'd occasionally call him, but he held a grudge.
No kidding.
And each time Carol called, Mel's reaction was cold. And over the years, the strain between father and daughter caused her relationship with her mother to fracture as well. Maria loved her daughter, but she was caught in the middle. And she's going to do what Mel tells her to do.
Yeah, it's kind of easy to be critical of Maria here too, but that's the relationship Maria was in, and things just weren't going to change there.
Nope, they weren't.
So Carol's ties to the church grew stronger. It seems like that's basically all she had besides her job. She participated in Bible studies and support groups, and because of Carol's compassion, a friend of hers named John got her involved in a prison ministry program. So at that point, Carol was 33 years old, still single, so she had quite a bit of time on her hands. Eventually, John asked her to write to an inmate who was interested in God, but who had stubbornly resisted becoming a Christian. So Carol was excited by the idea of changing the life of a hardened criminal, and she agreed to write to him. Soon after that, the man who was serving time for bank robbery became her regular pen pal, and this man's name was Dan Montecalvo.
So this is right up Carol's alley.
Yes.
She's going to change the life of a man.
She's going to fix him.
Going to fix him up.
So after just a few letters back and forth, Carol was really taken with him. He seemed to her to be thoughtful and sincere, and she felt like he'd been unfairly dealt a difficult hand in life. In Carol's opinion, his life was a textbook-like example of what can happen when a person doesn't get a chance to bond with his parents or feel loved during his childhood. So in the nature-nurture debate, she was definitely on the nurture side.
Yes, she was.
His letters told her how no one had given him a chance and how he had stolen money only because he was desperate to survive. And the more she learned about Dan, the more she began to think about meeting him in person and even helping him to become a positive member of society. But when that finally happened, just before Christmas 1978, Carol wasn't prepared for the impact that Dan made on her. She really liked him. He had these soft brown eyes, she said, and he was just crying out for affection. He was soft-spoken and appeared very vulnerable. So Carol not only felt excited by the challenge of understanding Dan, she also began to feel an overwhelming attraction to the thought of being needed by Dan.
Yeah, from the very beginning, Dan made it clear to Carol that he desperately needed her in his life. They spent the entire first day they met, walking around the visitor's courtyard, talking. Carol asked him questions trying to understand the history that had shaped him, and Dan seemed to be fascinated by her intelligence. He also told her he hadn't expected anyone as pretty as she was. This definitely got to her. Carol felt better about herself than she had in years. During the initial 3-hour visit, Dan became more talkative and seemed to be truly happy for what Carol decided must have been the first time in his life. Well, maybe not.
Well, she thought he was truly happy.
Yeah, and she's thinking, look at the good I'm doing for this poor man.
Yeah, and I think that's not unusual with women who marry prisoners. I mean, there are some benefits to it. You don't have to feed him. He's not going to cheat on you. You don't have to pick up his laundry. So if they're in prison, it can kind of be an ideal situation if you don't want to be bothered.
Well, yeah, I guess. I mean, you can be married without actually being married.
Right. It's really hard to think that it's a true relationship. But I think that Carol was very lonely, and she loved a challenge, and she loved to help people, and religion just made that more of a thing for her. So by the time she left Dan, he was thinking of Carol as his savior, the first visit. But in reality, Carol's education was no match for the street smarts that Dan had picked up throughout his life. And what Carol really didn't understand was that sometimes a person cannot be changed, and that there actually are people in the world who don't want to change. And that may have been Dan. But Carol was confident that Dan's troubled mind could be helped by the right person. And of course, she saw herself as that person. 1 month after their first visit, when Dan agreed to become a Christian, Carol believed she was really seeing a positive change. She became so convinced and so attached to Dan that she was thrilled when he brought up marriage. Now, at first, their conversations had only touched on how different their lives might have been if they'd met at another time and under other circumstances. But then Dan began to show her how serious he really was about her. He had strong feelings for her, and he told her that he loved her. So she'd done what no one else had been able to do. She'd changed his life, and this made her feel very successful. And Dan made her feel important. So Dan pretty much proposed marriage, but at the same time he told her he couldn't ask her to commit her life to him while he might be in prison for another 10 years. Then, about 1 year after they first met, they began searching for ways to make their dream of becoming a married couple a reality. By that time, Carol didn't care whether Dan was in prison or out. She was in love with him, and she believed he was a new man, a man of God. So she believed that she knew everything about him, and he had convinced her that they couldn't live without each other. So he was quite a manipulator, I think, too.
Yeah, I'm getting that impression.
Absolutely.
That he's got long-range plans. Carol's going to be involved in them. That she's going to be someone he's going to play.
Right. So they did agree to wait at least a year, praying that God would allow them to be together.
Well, it must have worked, because about a year later, prison officials granted Carol and Dan permission to be married. When it looked like the marriage would finally happen, Carol phoned her mother. He's in prison now, Mom, Carol explained, but he's had a terrible childhood. Now that we're exploring his past, he's becoming a completely different person. He's really a wonderful man.
Oh, my God.
That's what I want to hear. He's in prison now.
That's just what
don't worry,
she
he's
wanted
getting
to hear.
out.
Right.
Jeez.
So Maria, of course, was very skeptical. She wanted to stop Carol before she could ruin her life by making this huge mistake. But she also knew her daughter would become more determined if she disapproved, and she was likely right about that. And her husband would say enough about Carol's plans for the both of them anyway. Later, when she shared the news with Mel, he just shook his head angrily. And he said, "She's no longer the girl we raised, Maria. She has a mind of her own. I love her, but if that's how she wants to live, if that's the thanks we get for putting her through college, I wash my hands of her." So he's pretty harsh. And that, of course, made it worse because Carol's now left with very little outside support, and it makes Dan even more important. He's like her only lifeline.
Yeah, so less than 2 years later, Carol married Dan in the prison courtyard. She had bought herself an off-white cotton dress that hung just above her ankles. She held a bouquet of yellow and orange summer flowers. On the morning of July 14th, 1980, she promised to love and honor Dan Montecalvo as long as they both should live. Carol would say later that tears welled up in Dan's eyes when he repeated the promise to her. Dan looked more handsome than ever to Carol. He was dressed in a brand-new navy blue suit that she had bought for him. Armed guards watched from their posts as the short ceremony took place. But other than two of Carol's church friends, there were no family or friends there. Still, to Carol, the wedding was beautiful. This time, she said, she had no doubts she was marrying the right man. In her eyes, Dan had completely changed from the dishonest and self-destructive person he had been when he was younger. Dan was ready to love her the way no man had loved her before.
So while Carol and Dan were developing a bond despite his confinement, her relationship with her family was just fading away. Maria still talked with Carol as often as she could without making her husband angry, but whenever she suggested that Mel forgive Carol, he would just respond with anger and the subject would soon be closed. Maria loved her daughter unconditionally and wanted her husband to forgive Carol and include her in family activities and conversations. But when he refused, it broke Maria's heart. Her dream of a happy family reunion never happened. And then in 1982, Maria died of a heart attack. And when Carol attended her mother's funeral, she and her father barely spoke to one another. So it's very sad. This family was really broken up for no real good reason, except him being stubborn and judgmental. I really don't understand what she had to apologize for. She's making mistakes in life. We all do that.
She had nothing to apologize for.
No, she didn't. So with Dan still in prison, Carol was quite lonely, and her only contact with her family was an occasional letter to her sister Rosanna. Rosanna lived in a suburb in New York. Once in a while, she would write to her brother John, who was still living at home while working on his master's degree. So I think Mel had its thumb on John a little bit better than he did on his daughters.
Yeah, I wonder, though, when he gets his master's and gets a position somewhere,
Yeah.
if he's going to move out.
I would hope so for his sake that he did, but...
Well, he's a male, so he gets some special treatment.
That's true. They can usually get away with more when it comes to a man like Mel.
So after Dan was released from prison, this was January 1981, the couple moved to California. Now, Carol's letters from California were so upbeat that Rosanna never had any idea whether her sister was really happy in her marriage to Dan. She never mentioned any issues, but to do that would have been to admit that she'd made a mistake.
Yeah,
or
she did not want to do that. Right.
Can't do that.
She didn't want to do that. So Rosanna had always intended to visit Carol and Dan when they were living in Burbank, California, but her busy schedule kept her from making the trip. Then on April 1st, 1988, Rosanna received a call from her father. He was crying, something she had only seen him do before at her mother's funeral, but he told her that Carol was dead. Mel was distraught, his baby girl was gone, and the guilt of not speaking to her really overwhelmed him. All Rosanna could do was try and comfort him, but of course she too was devastated. Carol died on the evening of March 31st, 1988. She and Dan were planning a trip to Hawaii together. Knowing that it would be warmer than Burbank, where spring temperatures were dropping into the 50s at night, Carol packed t-shirts and big baggy shorts. As she sorted through her suitcase, she was likely thinking about how, in less than 12 hours, she and Dan would be on a plane, leaving LA County for the peaceful Hawaiian Islands. So she was still a very religious woman, and she prayed every night. And at this time, her prayers were mostly about her concerns about her husband's drinking. The problem had not affected their marriage, which Carol still believed was better than most. As far as she knew, Dan didn't cheat, and he didn't complain about the weight that she'd gained in the recent years. And for most of their marriage, he didn't drink any alcohol. So in Carol's mind, their problems had started in 1986, when a bleeding ulcer had forced Dan to quit working. Not long after that, he began drinking, which is one of the worst things you could do for an ulcer.
I was going to say, it's really good to have alcohol poured on top of that ulcer.
Ow, sounds painful. Well, at first, I guess he just had a few mixed drinks in the evening, but after a full year of being unemployed, drinking had become a big part of Dan's daily routine. Some evenings, he would come home so drunk that Carol worried he would kill someone while driving home from the bar. But being who she was, Carol began to think compulsively about ways that she could rescue Dan and improve the marriage. She believed Dan needed some time away at a place where he could regain his faith in God. And because of Dan's disability, they really had barely enough money to buy groceries and pay the household bills. So Carol tried really hard to come up with ways that they could put together the money for a trip. But any vacation would really be financially impossible. Carol prayed that God would somehow provide them with a means to get away together, and then her prayers were answered by a sales contest sponsored by her employer, Pacific Bell Yellow Pages. By this time, Carol was working there, and she was one of the best ad salespersons. And first prize for making the most sales was an all-expenses-paid trip to Hawaii. The couple had visited Hawaii early in their marriage, and during their stay, she felt like they'd fallen even deeper in love with each other. So Hawaii, she decided, would be the perfect place for Dan to rediscover their love, quit drinking, and come home a changed man. But that's really expecting a lot. She knew the changes would need to be drastic. By late 1987, Dan had turned 50, and he'd slid deeper into depression and alcohol abuse. He was no longer a young man with the endless opportunities to turn his life around that he once had. So Carol did have a lot of sympathy for him, a lot of compassion, really.
She did. Carol's at this point 42 years old, still no less in love with her husband than she had been when she'd married him. She felt like this trip might be Dan's last chance. The more Carol thought about the vacation, the harder she worked. Through the end of 1987 and into 1988, there were evenings when she wouldn't come home until 8 or 9 o'clock at night. She's really committed to winning this prize.
She is, plus she's, the breadwinner.
True.
So it was in January when the company named Carol the Southern California winner, and she could hardly wait to tell Dan the good news. If Dan had been thrilled later that night when he came home from the bars and heard about the trip, he was probably too drunk to remember because he was, kind of blacking out most nights. So Carol repeated the story to him the next morning, refusing to allow him to dampen her excitement. Her hopes and dreams for a brighter future were finally coming together, and Carol began planning their vacation. They scheduled it for that April and even managed to save enough money to lengthen their trip by 2 days. More than a week in Hawaii would definitely help Dan, Carol thought. He could stop drinking, maybe his ulcer would even get better, and then they could make plans for a better future. So she's really putting a lot on this trip.
Yeah, she believed deeply that Dan would stop drinking during this vacation. I wonder if they even talked about that.
That would be interesting to know. And I guess rehab wasn't a thing. She just thought being together and getting back in touch with God would take care of it. But quitting drinking is not that easy.
No, it's not.
No, he might have even needed some medical intervention for that, but that's just not the way Carol saw it.
No, you gotta have faith.
She's a little delusional too, though.
Yeah, actually Carol had convinced herself that this trip was going to change their entire lives.
She had, yeah.
Now, over the course of their marriage, Carol had gained about 60 pounds. She tended to put on weight when things in her life weren't going well. Carol tried to hide her excess weight by wearing fashionably loose black clothing. But if Dan minded Carol's weight, he didn't say so. Carol had commented to friends that Dan had always been patient and understanding about the weight she had gained over the years. In fact, others tended to notice Carol's weight far more than her husband did. Although he was a few inches taller than Carol, Dan was a relatively small guy. Now, to Carol, however, he seemed larger than life. He could charm her, and the soft way he spoke to her still made her feel special. Although she was well aware of Dan's troubled past, she saw him as a handsome but misunderstood gentleman with beautiful black-brown eyes, shiny black hair, and a charming mustache.
Well, you could call it charming. It kind of looked like a porn mustache. I don't know, I guess in the 80s maybe it was in fashion. So a little bit about Dan. Dan was born and raised in a poor neighborhood in Boston. His father was a criminal, and his father was killed in a shootout with police. His mother had drug and alcohol problems. So once Dan was a young teen, he followed in his late father's footsteps. And the way he spoke showed his lack of education. But that really didn't change Carol's high opinion of him. She thought he looked like James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause. And Carol's friends would smile politely when she talked about Dan that way. Love is blind, and that's okay. He was not the Prince Charming that Carol was making him out to be, though. He was 5'8", 170 pounds. He had thinning black hair combed over to the right side of his head, and his voice was very rough from years of cigarette smoking. His face had a ruddy complexion from excessive alcohol consumption, and while not really overweight, he was definitely soft around the middle. But to Carol, he was her prince. Their friends at Overcomers Faith Center Christian Church believed that physical shortcomings mattered little to either of the Montecalvos, who just always seemed really happy together and in love.
So on the night of Carol's death, Dan convinced her to go on a walk with him. She followed him down the hallway of the 3-bedroom house and out the front door. Dan locked the door behind them. 4 or 5 times a week, the Montecalvos walked in that direction, past neighbors' houses, around the block, and back home to their house. So a little half-mile walk, something like that.
Yeah, it wasn't the best neighborhood, but it was a cute area. Their street was lined with trees that fanned out to form an archway over the road. And set back 20 feet from the sidewalk, their single-story home was small, with an average-sized front and backyard. And the houses were separated by cement block walls. For the most part, the homes were built back in the 1950s, so they were pretty old. And there was one woman in the neighborhood, Susan with a Z, who took in boarders. Many people in the neighborhood felt certain that she was buying and selling more than Avon products, based on the amount of people coming and going at her address. And some neighbors even suspected her and some of her transient boarders of doing some burglaries in the neighborhood over the recent years. So Susan had a wheelchair, although she was constantly seen walking and even playing in the yard with her dog. Almost every night, she would roll her wheelchair out the front door and into her garage at 8 o'clock. Then she'd spend about 2.5 hours making popsicle stick lampshades. Then she'd go back into the house to watch the 11 o'clock news.
Well, that's why she needs boarders. She's making popsicle stick.
I don't think she was doing that for income. I don't know. She did sell some Avon, but she was definitely eccentric.
Yeah.
That's a nice way to put it.
I guess so.
On some nights, her routine included looking for Dan and Carol on their walk between 10 and 10:30, because the couple walked nearly every evening, and watching them pass was one way that Susan knew the time, because after 10:30 Susan would stop looking, knowing that the couple never walked later than that. So when Carol and Dan walked past her house that evening at 10:50, Dan didn't notice whether Susan was sitting in her garage. Maybe the couple had been too involved in their conversation to notice her. As they made their way around the block and back toward home, they didn't cross the street until they'd passed the house of their next-door neighbor, Ralph. And they did this on purpose to avoid Ralph's German shepherds, who would always bark at anyone who passed by. After his wife went to sleep that night, Ralph picked up the remote and turned the TV on. At 11 o'clock, the news came on. But at 11:01, when the intro song was almost finished, a sound caught his attention. So this was a scream or a cry, and it seemed to be coming from next door. Ralph hit the mute button and turned toward the noise, and he tried to make out the voices he heard then, but he could only tell that someone was frightened and upset. So for a second the voices stopped and Ralph continued to listen. Then the quiet was broken by two sudden cracks of what seemed to be a car backfiring. But before Ralph had time to consider the sounds, another single crack rang out. His wife woke up then, and he decided that that was 3 gunshots that he'd heard. So before they could decide what to do, they heard sirens coming to the neighborhood. Ralph went to the window and he watched the first police car arrive at the Montecalvo house. A uniformed officer with his gun drawn carefully climbed out of his cruiser using the car door as a shield. And keeping his head low, the officer ran across the street. At 11:06, Ralph's dogs started barking, and they were so loud he was worried that they would ruin the officer's cover. Ralph believed the gunmen were still inside the Montecalvo house.
And the police obviously thought that was a possibility too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the 911 call came into the Burbank Police Department at 11:03. Operator Janet Brown answered the call, and the computerized 911 emergency system displayed the caller's address and telephone number on Janet's screen. And at the same time, the system's recording device clicked on. "Please help me. Hurry up." The man was hysterical, screaming and sobbing as he spoke, and Janet could not understand him. "We've been shot. My wife's bleeding. She's dying. Hurry." For a moment, the man continued to cry into the phone, while Janet and her coworker began sending emergency calls to police in the area. At 11:04 and 20 seconds, the caller hung up, apparently convinced that help was on the way. Janet redialed the telephone number that appeared on the screen, while her coworker told police and paramedics that someone at 315 South Myers Street had just been shot.
Right, so they called him back. At 11:05, the phone rang in Dan and Carol's house. Dan answered it on the second ring, and for a split second, Janet Brown thought she had the wrong number. Either she'd caught the man between sobs, or this wasn't the same hysterical caller who she'd spoken with a minute earlier. Then, before Janet had a chance to identify herself, the man began crying loudly. Then he became enraged. He was yelling, "Somebody help! My wife's been shot, and I've been shot. My wife is dying here." So the operator asked him for details on his wife's condition, but he just wasn't helpful. He said there was blood everywhere, that they'd walked into the house and someone had tried to kill him and his wife. He said they started shooting and that there were 2 people. Then he paused for a moment, sobbing loudly into the telephone. He said that the 2 intruders had left through the front door. And then, for some weird reason, he hung up on the operator again. But every available Burbank police officer began responding. A 187 in progress meant that someone was being murdered. In Burbank, police might go an entire year with just 1 or 2 murders. So at 11:05, when Janet was still talking with Dan, the first officer had arrived at the scene. So that was just 57 seconds after the call had come in. Pretty good.
A good response.
Yeah. But it would be another 7 minutes before the police would enter the house. Later, doctors would disagree about whether an earlier entry would have made a difference in Carol's survival. Officers said they were worried the suspects might still be inside, and they waited 7 full minutes before going in. When Dan hung up on Janet the second time, she leaned back in her chair and she frowned. She just had a strange feeling about the call. When she'd returned Dan's call, it was like at first he wasn't even upset. Then, after a second, he was all of a sudden hysterical again. So when police started to arrive, the entire neighborhood seemed to be asleep. There were lights on at only a few houses, including the house where the shooting had happened. Carol and Dan's house was the only house on the block that was completely lit up, and that was just the way Dan and Carol had left it when they took their walk. And this was unusual because burglars normally break into dark homes that look empty, like no one's home, and this definitely looked like someone was there.
Yeah, it's all lit up, and there's cars in the driveway.
Right. So Officer Rick Medlin was about 4 miles from South Myers Street when he got the order to report to a murder in progress. 3 minutes after that, he was at the scene and several police cars were already there. He parked 5 houses away, drew his gun, and climbed out of the car. Then he made his way from one front yard to the next. Several officers were already scattered on the lawn of the house next door with their guns drawn. Medlin turned and watched the house, looking and listening for any signs of life. He did notice that 2 cars were parked in the driveway, and he thought that was strange that someone would break into a house with 2 cars sitting in the driveway. Then a man with dark hair began walking in the hallway toward the Montecalvo's front door. For a moment, the man stood in the doorway, watching the police activity on his front lawn. Then he grabbed his right side and began limping down the steps. This was Dan.
He's got to look the part, right?
Well, we can't assume that, but people did get that idea. His behavior did seem a little off.
Well, you got the 911 operator.
Right.
With that stuff, and then this one, the police officer's looking into the house, sees a man walking down the hallway towards the front door.
Yeah.
And then it's like the guy sees the cop out there and clutches his right side and begins limping.
Yeah, that's pretty much what happened. An officer across the street notified dispatch that a man had exited the residence, and this was at 11:09. By then, a police helicopter was flying overhead looking for suspects, and Dan started yelling for help. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and faced the officers. "I've been shot," he said. "Can't you see that? Why won't someone get over here and help me?" So unsure if Dan was just a victim or if he had been a shooter, police took custody of him and asked him questions. He had been shot once in the back just above his right hip, and although he was complaining of severe abdominal pain, there was very little blood coming out of that wound or around the wound. Inside, Carol was lying motionless in the hallway in a thick pool of clotting blood, and she wasn't breathing at all. Her eyes were open and lifeless, and her face was covered with sticky dark blood. She'd been lying in a pool of her own blood for several minutes, and it had coagulated into clots the size of cotton balls, and those were stuck to her face and the carpet, so it was quite a sight. Carol had 2 large holes in the back of her neck, and the fleshy area just above her chin had a hole where one of the bullets had exited her body. Now later the bullets would be examined by forensic experts to determine what caliber gun had fired them. In her right hand, Carol was holding a balled-up paper towel and automobile registration papers. Near her head, there was a set of keys, and her skin was already cool to the touch. So she had been deceased for several minutes. Meanwhile, Dan wasn't cooperating with the paramedics at all.
Yeah, as they began to wheel Carol on a stretcher toward the ambulance, Dan jumped up and ran toward the house, with no sign of the limp he'd had when he first appeared in the doorway. "I have to see my wife," he shouted. "Why won't someone help her?" The drive to the hospital took about 5 minutes, but it gave officers a chance to think about Dan's behavior. At first, he hadn't seemed to remember that his wife was dying inside, because he was busy limping and complaining about his own injury. But when they tried to take him away from the scene, he wanted to know her condition, and he was suddenly able to jump off the stretcher and run. The miracle.
Yeah, at the hospital, although the nurses had not yet given him any drugs, Dan seemed much calmer than he'd been back at the house. And he complained of pain and asked again about his wife. So when asked by the police what had happened, Dan simply said burglars. When asked to start from the beginning, though, he began to talk. "Me and the wife were on vacation, supposed to go to Hawaii tomorrow morning. Had the trip all planned out and everything," he said. "Tonight we packed and went out to eat at the Pancake House here in Burbank. And after that, went by the May Company. You know, bought some stuff for the trip, and then we came home." So he said they'd gotten home around 9:30 or 10, then they did some packing and took a walk. The walk was at about 10:30 or 10:45, and when they returned, Dan said he noticed that the registration tags on Carol's car were about to expire, and since they were planning on driving her car to the airport the next day, He wanted to make sure that he changed the tags so they wouldn't get pulled over. He had the new tags in the glove box of his car. So he went to get them, and he asked Carol to go inside and get a wet paper towel to clean off the old stickers. Then Dan said when his wife walked inside, he heard her shout, "What are you doing here?" And then all of a sudden there were 2 loud shotgun blasts. He ran inside the house, and right away he was grabbed from behind around his waist. And he said that he never had a chance to see what the guy looked like. And before he could get free, he heard a gun go off a 3rd time and felt a sharp pain in his right side. So he knew he'd been shot. He fell to the floor then, he said, and just lay there for a few seconds. And while he was on the floor, it seemed like he felt someone moving near his head, and he heard someone say, "Come on, let's get out of here." He said it was a man's voice, but the man hadn't talked very loudly. He didn't recognize the voice at all.
So Dan said as he was lying there in pain, he thought about Carol and wanted to help her. So he got up and walked into the hallway. He said that he found her, and she was just lying there bleeding. He checked her, and he knew she was still alive, he added. Then he prayed for a moment before running into the bedroom to call for help, but he couldn't get the phone to work. So he ran into the den and called from there, and that's when he saw their cash box pried open and lying empty on the floor. He said it had held about $800 in cash. So when Dan mentioned the cash box, the police believed that this was likely a burglary that Carol had walked in on. There had been some home break-ins in the neighborhood in the past year or so. So after calling 911 and hanging up and getting a call back from the 911 operator and hanging up again, Dan said that he went back to Carol and she was still alive. He said he didn't give mouth-to-mouth or any compressions, but he felt a pulse on her neck. Dan sounded angry that it had taken the paramedics so long to arrive. He was also upset that the police had held guns on him and took him for questioning.
Yeah, so he did have a real injury. X-rays had shown that he would need emergency surgery to remove a bullet that was lodged near his intestines. But before he was taken to surgery, he was told that Carol could not be saved and she died. Then Dan had screamed and become hysterical. And one thing the detectives did take note of was that there were no tears shed by Dan. His eyes were completely dry. And that's a no-no.
Yeah, we hear that over and over again.
You sure do.
So if you're guilty of something and you're crying,
you
got to
tears.
Produce some water.
You really do. You do. So the Montecalvo's neighbor, Susan, was an eccentric woman, like I said, and she was sleeping with a new boarder named Ron. He was also supplying her with speed. On the morning after Carol's murder, Susan started to believe that she had heard someone run past the woodpile beside her house, and she heard the gunshots. She also thought she may have seen blood on Ron's hands as he washed them in their kitchen. So she's kind of having hallucinations maybe. Hard to say, because the police really won't take her seriously. But after she heard footsteps along the side of the house, she felt almost certain that she had heard the woodpile come crashing down. First there'd been gunfire, then about a minute later there'd been the sound of someone running beside her house. And a few seconds after that, the woodpile had come crashing down. But the problem was she could no longer distinguish whether this new information came from her memory or her imagination. So she totally forgot about it for the day. But her mind came back to it that evening, and she again began thinking about the murder and the noises that she'd heard. She'd long since forgotten about the bloodstains that she was convinced she had seen on her boarder Ron's hands. So after 9 o'clock, the day after the murder, plainclothes officers began door-to-door interviews with neighbors. From inside her home, Susan watched the officers make their rounds. She turned from the window, grabbed a flashlight, and walked into her backyard to look at the wood pile. The pile had collapsed, and small logs were scattered on the ground. She also saw a shoe print there. It was a deep indentation next to the woodpile in the dirt, between the pile and the cement wall closest to the Montecalvo house. So suddenly she knew she had to tell the officers about it. So she unlocked the gate that led her to the front yard and went out to find the police.
Susan ran up to 2 policemen and told them she had something important to show them. She showed them the woodpile and the supposed footprint, saying it was definitely a Reebok shoe print. But after hearing Susan talk, police were convinced that she was the crazy woman neighbors had warned them about. She seemed harmless, but they made a note to keep an eye on her. They advised her to stay away from the footprint for a few days in case they wanted to send someone over to make a plaster cast impression of it.
Yeah, so we don't really know what the police saw. There was no report, so was she just seeing a footprint that wasn't there, or was there really a footprint? We just don't know.
Yeah.
But that evening, Susan never mentioned that she might know who killed Carol. She said nothing about Ron and how many times she believed she had seen him wash his hands the night before. As the officers left her yard that night, Susan was sure that they would be back to make a plaster impression of the shoe print. And because of that, Susan was very surprised when the police didn't return to make a cast of the print. As the days of the murder investigation wore on, that forgotten footprint grew more and more difficult to see until it finally disappeared completely. So there was no follow-up on that.
No, if it was even there.
Right, we just don't know.
Dan's x-rays showed that a single .25 caliber bullet had entered the right side of his back, just above his hip bone. This bullet was lodged in the left front of his body, near his small intestines. Although doctors wanted to perform surgery as quickly as possible, Dan's condition was not a matter of life or death. Doctors would later say that left untreated, Dan perhaps would have gotten peritonitis and possibly even died from the illness. But unlike Carol's, Dan's gunshot wound was never life-threatening.
No. Well, as Dan was laying on the operating table, a technician prepared to perform a gunshot residue test on his hands. The technician took a Q-tip, dipped it in solution, and wiped it across his palms and his fingers. Then she took a disc-like piece of paper and pressed it on the same parts of his hand. Dan asked the tech what she was doing, and after he was told that a gunshot residue test was being done, he stopped asking questions. But those in the room with him would remember that, as his sample was sealed in an evidence jar, Dan's face seemed to have grown very pale. After his surgery, Dan asked to speak to someone from the group Women's Aglow, and this was a group of Carols. He wanted to speak to a woman that knew Carol. So 3 women from the group went to his hospital room to see him, and as they approached Dan's room, they saw that he was sitting in a comfortable chair, just staring calmly at the TV. So the women thought, this poor guy, he's probably in shock. He kind of looked like he was just enjoying a laid-back afternoon. Didn't look like he was grieving or upset. But then he turned toward them and suddenly began to sob. The women looked at each other, each having noticed the sudden onset of emotion. And as they moved closer, they could see that Dan was not just crying, he was sweating. Droplets of sweat began running down his forehead and neck, and his loud crying and profuse sweating continued for like 5 minutes or more, while the women just stood there uncomfortably in that small room. Then, as suddenly as the emotional outburst had started, it stopped. Dan just stopped crying and looked at the women. So his eyes were dry, but sweat drops were rolling down his forehead, and he sounded angry when he asked if they knew why the police did a gunshot residue test on him. He looked nervous now, and he began firing questions about why the police suspected him and why they were still searching his house. I guess one of the 3 women had previously worked in law enforcement, so he thought she should give him some information. But he made the women feel very uncomfortable.
I'll bet.
So before they were able to leave, Dan asked them to get the doctor to release him because he wanted to go right back home. And they were really put off a bit by that idea. Why would he want to return home so soon? Because Carol's blood would still be on the floor. And they expected that he would want to avoid the scene of his wife's murder. But he didn't.
Needed to get home.
Yep. So 3 hours after Carol's murder, field evidence technicians had begun performing a search and an investigation of the murder scene. And at that time, based on the information they'd received from Dan, they were working under the assumption that there'd been a burglary. So evidence techs looked for details about point of entry, signs of forced entry, missing valuables, fingerprints, and more. And inside the home, the first clue about how the burglars had entered the home was found. The rear den sliding window that led to the backyard had been opened before the police arrived. So the deduction then was that the point of entry must have been through that back door. But there was still a question of whether or not entry had been forced. When Dan told the police that his house had been locked up when he and Carol took their walk, what he'd really meant was that the front door and the back screen door had been locked. Dan was a smoker, so on a typical night, the rear sliding glass door was open to allow cigarette smoke out. So if burglars had entered the home through the back of the house, they wouldn't have had to do anything to that door because it would already be open. Police did look for pry marks near or around door jambs, broken windows, and any missing lock mechanisms, but there was nothing. Checking the back screen door for signs of forced entry, they did see that a screen had been slit just inches from the lock, and they thought that was proof of forced entry. So with that evidence to point to forced entry, missing property, and all that, police began to suspect that this murder was related to an unsolved homicide that had happened a year earlier, just a few blocks away. That case involved an off-duty sheriff's deputy, Charles Anderson, who was shot and killed when he surprised burglars in his home. So because the two cases appeared similar, police notified the LA County Sheriff's Department. Although Burbank police had jurisdiction in murders that occurred within city limits, county sheriff investigators were still working with the Burbank police to solve the Anderson murder because the victim had been a member of law enforcement. So when they heard about this latest case, several sheriff's deputies and evidence experts came to the scene. And one of those experts was a fingerprint specialist deputy, Linda Arthur, who prior to investigating the Montecalvo murder had dusted for fingerprints at more than 300 murder scenes. And she found several fresh prints on both the rear door and the cash box. So investigators had what looked like plenty of evidence that there'd been a burglary at the house. 2 officers had learned that one neighbor had heard his ladder fall off his backyard brick fence, while another neighbor had noticed his window screen lying on the ground. So they've got the point of entry, proof of forced entry, missing money, fingerprints, shoe prints, and signs that a burglar had been in the neighborhood. So at 5:55 that morning, a report was written up that the Burbank Police Department believed it had evidence enough to prove that a burglary had occurred. No one had considered that anyone other than a burglar could have been responsible for Carol's murder, and that is until Burbank Detective Lynch did a computer check of Dan Montecalvo's background. Then things changed. A list of criminal charges showed up on the police computer screen. Multiple bank robberies, concealed weapons, impersonating an officer, and breaking and entering were among them. But, Dan had never been a very smart criminal. Actually, when he was arrested for bank robbery, he got caught because he'd given the teller a "give me all your money" note, and he'd written it on the back of a deposit slip that had his name and address on it. So that's how he got caught.
Yeah, he's a criminal genius.
Yeah, not.
Now, while the police began looking at Dan Montecalvo in the days after Carol's murder, Susan Brown was with 3 of her friends, staying inside day and night. None of them spoke about what had happened the night of March 31st, but Susan did more drugs than usual. The Monday after Carol's murder, Susan contacted her landlord and told him that she planned to break her lease by moving immediately. She didn't mind losing her deposit, and she didn't care if breaking her lease meant losing him as a reference. If burglars were breaking into their houses in the area, she would find somewhere else to live.
Yeah, so it's really hard to figure out this Susan, but I think we have to admit that she would never be a credible witness. The irony was that Susan sometimes believed that no one was more capable of burglarizing a house than she and her friends. By her recollection, her boarder Ron had helped her with some neighborhood break-ins. In between taking hits of speed and then reversing the effects with huge amounts of alcohol, Susan spent hours trying to talk about their crimes. And then just moments later, she'd be convinced that they hadn't burglarized the Montecalvo house or anyone else's. So just depending on her mood, Susan seemed to have at least 2 different personalities. But if you're really taking the speed a lot, I think you can hallucinate.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and become paranoid as well.
Mm-hmm.
To the church friends who stopped in and visited Dan at the hospital, he said police were trying to find evidence that would connect him with Carol's murder. He said they were trying to frame him, so he needed to do whatever he could to get the officers out of his house. That way, they wouldn't be able to fabricate evidence and look for clues that, according to Dan, just weren't there. Dan was so paranoid about police that each day he became more convinced they were spying on him, tapping his phone conversations, and ignoring, hiding, or even destroying anything that might go against their theory that Dan had killed Carol.
Police found out that Dan had 4 or 5 life insurance policies on Carol, which added up to about $600,000. But they didn't find the murder weapons. It turned out Carol had been shot twice with a .38, while Dan was shot once with a smaller caliber weapon, a .22.
So that's pretty suspicious right there.
Yeah, you might be thinking there's more than one burglar.
Well, he said there were 2 intruders, but, why did she get the bigger bullet? She got 2 big bullets. He got 1 small bullet. So whenever someone's killed and then the other person is just kind of injured, you have to wonder. Because why would they leave one alive and not the other? And you think they'd shoot the guy who would be more of a threat.
I know, but we've seen this time and again in our journeys through true crime.
Yeah.
Where the murderer makes sure that his victim is dead, and then will give himself a flesh wound.
Sure.
Or some fairly insignificant injury.
Yeah.
Just to show that he's been shot also.
Right. We've seen that many times. But Dan's gun residue tests came back negative, and after examining each piece of evidence in every police report, the police decided there just wasn't enough reason to believe a burglary had taken place the night that Carol was murdered. So this was despite the slit screen door, the empty cash box, and the unidentified footprints that were found on the kitchen floor, all which had seemed like evidence of a burglary only a few days earlier. But then after learning about Dan's criminal past, they decided that the slit in the screen was probably just caused by normal wear and tear, and Dan had probably taken the missing cash himself. And maybe a repairman had left footprints in the kitchen because they weren't footprints in blood. The Burbank Police Department then focused its investigation totally on Dan. So they were pretty soon convinced that Dan had done it. And I'm sure a lot of it was related to just his behavior. He acted really strange.
Yeah, he wasn't acting the right way.
No, and his history, not good.
No, although he's never been charged with murder or manslaughter.
Nope, no, he hasn't.
So 8 days after Carol's murder, the police department learned that Dan planned to sue them. The suit, which was not officially filed until several months later, accused the Burbank Police Department of causing Carol's death because of its unacceptably long response time the night she was shot. Dan probably hoped the lawsuit would take some of the heat off him, but investigators had no intention of letting Dan's impending lawsuit slow down their investigation.
They didn't, and throughout the spring and into the summer, detectives went over the police reports written after Carol's murder. They were just looking for areas where details might be missing. On July 15th, they called Officer Medlin into the office, and the original report that Medlin had written about the night of Carol's murder included only essential facts. For instance, he hadn't written about the barking dogs at the neighbor's house where he'd been crouched in the front yard. Neighbors had since been interviewed and none of them had heard dogs barking until after the police arrived. So that meant, in all likelihood, burglars had not escaped from the Montecalvo home after the shooting. So he'd also not written about lights being on in the house or Dan walking normally down the hall until he saw the police, when he started grabbing his side and limping. Months went by and the investigation continued, but it just didn't seem to be going anywhere. Not until January 16th, 1989, nearly a year after her murder. And that's when the investigation was handed over to Detective Brian Arnspiger. Detective Arnspiger was known for his obsession with detail. So while the police were busy investigating, Dan got close to an old church friend of Carol's, and we're going to call her Anne. She asked Dan, who had recently sold his house on South Myers Street, to move into her apartment and take care of her place in exchange for free rent, while she was away in Texas on business for 6 months. So she hoped the move would help Dan get back on his feet financially. And Dan suddenly found himself in a comfortable financial situation, because now he had $150,000 in proceeds from the sale of his home, and at about the same time, he collected $220,000 from the largest of Carol's life insurance policies. Dan paid off some of his gambling debts. He took his newly acquired funds, and on October 28, 1988, he made a gambling trip to the Golden Nugget Casino in Nevada. By New Year's Day, 1989, he was visiting Las Vegas several times a month, playing blackjack, and his average bet per hand was $350.
He's got all this money.
So he's a big gambler. So when Anne returned to Burbank in late January, she was immediately notified by her homeowners association that some problems had come up while she was gone. They said her condo had been the site of numerous loud parties in the past 6 months. Also, many sex workers had been seen going to and from her home at all hours. So when Anne first entered her home, she saw that there were smoke stains marking the walls, and her once white curtains were a dingy yellow. There were cigarette burns on her marble kitchen countertop. So her place was almost unrecognizable compared to the clean and bright home it had once been. "I already heard the stories, Dan," she told him. "You know I'm on the board of directors for the Homeowners Association." So she waited for his explanation and an apology, but Dan just looked at her defiantly, and he said that the stories were not true. He said sure, a sex worker or two may have dropped by from time to time, but it was just to discuss some gambling debts. So she hesitated and thought for a moment, but then she told him she believed him.
Huh.
Yeah, she was actually disappointed in herself for questioning the husband of her dear departed friend Carol. She'd expected the house to be messy anyway because she knew Dan had never been particularly tidy or responsible. And she felt bad for him because he just lost his wife and just seemed totally lost without Carol. She thought he was still paralyzed by grief. So how could she expect him to handle day-to-day chores? So these church people are so forgiving.
I tell you, by the spring of 1989, before the first anniversary of Carol's murder, Dan had lost $53,000 in Las Vegas casinos, something he never mentioned to Ann. In fact, there were many things about Dan's background that Ann knew nothing about. In late July, detectives decided that she should know more about Dan. When security guards from Ann's condo complex told her that the police had been asking questions about her involvement with Dan Montecalvo, she immediately called him to let him know. For the first time since befriending Dan, she allowed herself to become too involved in his life. Doubt had begun to grow in her mind. Dan was always so angry at the police that it seemed extreme. And after the police filled her in on his past behavior, and his behavior since Carol's murder, she began to feel afraid of him. So he was living with her.
No, he lived there while she was gone. He didn't stay and live with her.
He was over at her house an awful lot.
An awful lot, yeah. He was using her. So once Detective Arnspigo had time to go over the case file, he felt like he'd struck gold. A pair of Dan's pants were at the bottom of one of the boxes, and he pulled it out and saw numerous blood spots on the lower pant legs, including the knees. The evidence tag read Dan Montecalvo, 33188. Someone else might have completely missed the significance, but Brian had just returned from San Bernardino, where he'd taken an extensive course on blood spatter, and this was taught by Detective Craig Aguino. His reputation for solving murders by examining the angle and diameter of blood spots had made him famous among law enforcement officers all over the country, and Arnspigo had been fascinated. So when he returned to Burbank after 3 days, he learned more about bloodstains, blood spots, and backspatter than he thought he'd ever be able to use. But that was before he found Dan's blood-stained pants. According to Dan, he'd been outside the house when Carol was shot, and minutes later Dan knelt at Carol's side to take her pulse, and when doing this, he would have knelt in blood near her head and picked up splotches of blood on his knees. So Dan's explanation had gone unchallenged. But now it was clear that his version of events didn't add up. There were nearly 50 tiny circular blood spots on the pant legs, and those spots told a new version of the story. Firearms specialists and field evidence technicians had already determined that Carol had been shot from a range of no more than 4 feet. One of the bullets had pierced the major artery that ran along her spine, so the blood would have splashed backwards, spraying whoever held the gun. Carol's blood had saturated the carpet in the hallway of her home, and there was a crusty ring of dried blood around her face, and her face was pretty much submerged in it. So if Dan had knelt anywhere near her head as he claimed, the knees and the lower pants would have been saturated with blood. There wouldn't be spots. So if Dan had been outside when Carol was shot, there wouldn't have been any blood spatter on his pants. The only way that would happen was if he was near her body when she was shot. So this meant he could have been the shooter, and there was no way that he was outside when she was shot. But the police still thought they didn't have enough to arrest him. They did think that his motive for killing Carol was financial. He owed tens of thousands to loan sharks in Vegas, and he was in big trouble. Carol had $800 of cash in their box to bring to Hawaii for their vacation. So Dan may have taken that money, and maybe they fought about it the night before their trip. Then, maybe Dan killed Carol out of anger and in order to collect on her insurance. So detectives had Dan followed, and they noticed him spending a lot of time at casinos and bars. They learned that even back when Carol was alive, Dan was going out drinking and bringing women home for sex while she was at work. He was also known for hanging out at certain bars and showing off a handgun, and one bar had threatened to call the cops on him, but he left before the police could arrive.
Then one night, a Glendale police officer was following a DUI driver who pulled over and ran off trying to escape. Now, this driver was Dan. Police were able to chase him down and arrest him. He failed the breathalyzer test, so the police searched his car, and they found a gun. Now, as a convicted felon, it's illegal for Dan to own a gun. And next to the gun, there's a screenplay manuscript titled A Grief Denied, written by Dan about how he had suffered since his wife's death. And when Dan was walked into the police station to be booked, he leaned over and whispered in a policeman's ear, "When I get out of here, I'm going to kill your wife and your kids."
Oh, good whispering.
So while Dan was held in jail, the police got a search warrant for his new house, where he's living with a new girlfriend. They hoped to find something to help them solve Carol's murder. So in Dan's house, they found a diary where he had written down everyone the police had interviewed and what they told him was asked and answered. So he had been following the investigation pretty closely. They also found a key to a storage space at a local storage facility.
Yeah, so the police got a warrant for the storage locker, and in the locker, they found a hollowed-out book with impressions in it from 2 weapons. And these impressions were consistent with the size and shape of a .38 and a .22. The murder weapons had likely been hidden in plain sight when they first searched the home. So detectives put together over 800 pages of evidence and took it to the DA to build a case against Dan for Carol's murder. "18 months after Carol's death, Dan went on trial. So that's pretty quick, actually.
Mm-hmm.
He pleaded not guilty, and the prosecutor had 85 witnesses and 163 pieces of circumstantial evidence. And the trial lasted for 6 weeks. The DA told the jury the tragic tale of the kind and religious Carol, who felt like she could save Dan's soul. Their theory was that Carol discovered the missing $800 on the night she was killed. Then Dan had staged a robbery, killing Carol and injuring himself. On the same day that Carol was murdered, Dan had sent a gambling debt payment of $500 to Vegas, and he couldn't say where he'd gotten the $500.
So Dan was found guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. He served almost 13 years before he died in prison of sepsis. So he had a blood infection. Those are pretty serious.
Yeah.
So
It wasn't the healthiest either.
No, he wasn't. So he could have had any number of injuries that let bacteria get into his bloodstream.
Sure.
He maintained his innocence until he died. Neither of the murder weapons were ever recovered.
So interestingly, neighbor Susan Brown confessed to the robbery of the Montecalvo house and the murder of Carol after Dan was convicted. The LA County District Attorney's Office didn't believe her, though. The prosecutor in the case said that Susan was lying when she suddenly came forward and that her confession did not match the facts of the crime. But Susan told the LA Times that she and her friends were under the influence of drugs and looking for money to buy more drugs when they decided to burglarize the Montecalvo house. In an earlier interview, she'd told the DA's investigators that 2 men had shot the Montecalvos when the couple returned home from an evening walk. But the 2 men she identified denied any involvement in the crime, and the men's fingerprints didn't match any of the unidentified prints that were found in the house. Still, Susan insisted that she was in the house on the night of the murder, and that she had witnessed Carol being shot. She even said that she shot Dan herself. But in researching her background, investigators learned that she'd been in several mental hospitals, and she'd received a psychiatric discharge from the military. Susan also said she suffered from PTSD from being in Vietnam, and that she was in psychiatric units to deal with the stress from the war and her drug problems. But she said her psychiatric problems didn't necessarily make her a liar. And that's a fair point.
That's true.
I just don't think she'd ever be believable in court.
No, she wouldn't be.
But it's still a bit of a mystery. We think he did it, but there are some doubts. The investigation was not perfect. Mistakes were made for sure.
Yeah, but it doesn't look like she did anything.
No, it does look like he did it. So, I don't know. Marrying a prisoner does have its risks. Not all prisoners are bad, but this guy certainly was. Even if he didn't kill her, he was very shitty.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
I'd like to know how many prison marriages end up in divorce or physical harm to one of the 2 people.
Well, they'd have to get out of prison for that to happen, right?
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. We could look that up. That would be interesting. I know before we talked about the Menendez brothers and how they're both married and how that would be an interesting thing to look into.
Yeah, it would be.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now it's time for my bi-weekly reminders before we move on to listener feedback. We have a premium option of TCB, which gives you early ad-free and bonus shows. It's a lot of fun to do, and it's a great way to support the show. You can subscribe at tiegrabber.com, patreon.com/subscribe. Or if you prefer, you can subscribe at patreon.com/tiegrabber. And you'll get the same benefits, which are ad-free shows. You get each show early. You get a bonus show every month. And we send you a gift with a thank you note because we really appreciate the support. Some other ways to support the show are to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Some other ways to support the show are to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever it is that you listen to us. We'd also love it if you'd send us an email or a voicemail with your feedback and case suggestions, or if you just tell your friends to check out our show. If you do have feedback or case suggestions for us to cover on an upcoming show, you can send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, and voicemails can be sent by clicking on the voicemail link in our show notes or on our website. So as always, we appreciate you spending your time with us at the quiet end, and maybe you want to hang around for some feedback.
It's time for listener feedback.
Yeah, we have emails. I got 4 emails for you this time. No voicemails. Kind of slow in the voicemail department these days.
It has been slow. And we love to get voicemails that praise us and say nice things, but those we don't use in feedback. So we'd love to get some voicemails with case suggestions or feedback on cases that we've done.
Yeah, that would be ideal.
We would like that, but that's not to say anything against these emails because they're very good.
Yeah, you can keep the emails coming too.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us about the first one?
Okay, this is from David, and this is really a long letter. So I'm just going to kind of summarize it. David's a parachuter, and he knows a lot.
Yeah, I saw his email, and it had diagrams and pictures.
Yeah, and what it comes down to is that it's really, really difficult to make a parachute and its backup fail. You need skills and tools, the right tools to do this. So Emil probably has the skills, and the tools wouldn't be too difficult to get a hold of.
Well, yeah, I think that even with the other cases we mentioned, it said that you really had to be an expert in order to do this.
Then the other part is that before you jump, you do a buddy check. So I check your parachute, you check my parachute.
Right.
But I'm sure that if they're diving as a couple, that they checked each other.
Right, but he wasn't on the plane with her, so she must not have had anyone on the plane check it. She didn't mention that.
No.
She did say that Emil checked it the day before while they were waiting and the weather was bad. So I don't know if that was overlooked or what, but that's fascinating.
Very interesting.
Yeah, thanks, David, for your insights on that. I'm going to read more about it because I think it's fascinating. Okay, our next email's from Amy, and Amy has a case suggestion. She wrote, after working a long New Year's Eve shift at the end of 2019, Rebecca Hogue, then a 28-year-old cocktail waitress, arrived home in Norman, Oklahoma around 4 a.m. and went to check on her 2-year-old son. During work, she'd left Ryder with her boyfriend, Christopher Trent, who had put him to bed in his crib, where he appeared to be sleeping. So Hogue turned in for the night, but when she woke up a few hours later, Trent was gone, and her toddler, still in the crib, was not breathing. So she called 911 in a panic, and the boy was dead. So in November, Hogue was convicted of first-degree murder, even though she never laid a hand on the boy. At a sentencing hearing, a judge will decide whether to send her to prison for life, as the jury recommended. So that hearing's probably happened?
Yes, it has.
So Amy writes, how is that possible? Well, Hogue was convicted under Oklahoma's failure to protect law, which requires parents to shield their kid from physical harm if they're aware, or should have been aware, that another adult was abusing the child.
So what happened with the judge? Even though the jury had recommended life imprisonment, the judge sentenced her to 16 months, and she had already served that while waiting trial, so she went home, except she has been found guilty of murder.
Well, the jury had recommended a life sentence.
Yes, but the judge said no. So she ended up serving like 13 months and is free.
Well, life does seem extreme for that, but were there signs of earlier abuse that she should have known? That's my question.
Well, we'll have to check that.
Yeah, because if it was just that one night, she came home that late and went to bed, I don't see what she did wrong.
I wouldn't either.
No.
And another interesting note is that I think 3 days after the baby had died, the guy watching her, Trent, killed himself.
Because he killed that child, I'm sure.
Probably.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the inference I take from that.
And I might even say that she's punished enough by losing her child in such a tragic way. That had to be awful. And she'll have to live with that for life, no matter what.
And there's still a lot of people that think she should not have been charged at all.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say not knowing, right? Not knowing what the history was.
The way that law is written, if you knew or should have known.
Should have known. How do you interpret that? That's up to interpretation, I think. That's kind of a gray area, should have known.
Yeah. Well, I guess an extreme example would be that the child had been in an ER for something and they found healing fractures.
Right. But then the doctor would have to report it.
Yeah.
Or the nurse, yeah.
Or at postmortem, they found old fractures. I don't know. There's lots of things.
Well, that's all I can think of is that if there was past abuse that she should have known about, or if there's some way that they figured out that she did know, I could see that. But otherwise, it just seems kind of crazy.
It does.
Okay, why don't you read us our next email?
Okay, this is another case suggestion. The person's name I'm just going to take from the email address, which is G. Klappenbach. And she wrote, I have a case suggestion about a 1987 unsolved murder case. I've listened to many of your podcasts and realize you do not showcase many unsolved cases, but I'm hoping you would take on this case. My cousin, Sandra Lynn Williams, 20 years old, left her home in Beebe, Arkansas, April 25th, 1987. She's going to her boyfriend's house for a cookout around 4:30 p.m. Now, the boyfriend lived like 50 minutes away. And around 9 or 10 that night, the boyfriend contacted Sandra's mother and informed her that Sandra never showed up. Her car had been abandoned on the side of the road close to Romance, Arkansas, which was on the route to her boyfriend's house. And she herself was found 2 weeks later, about 3.5 miles from her car, in the woods. She had been stabbed multiple times.
Wow. So did they eliminate the boyfriend as a...
Yes, it's an unsolved case.
Well, unsolved, that doesn't mean necessarily that he's been eliminated. Well, we'll look into it and we appreciate it. We're certainly not crime solvers, though.
No, but we'd be interested in doing unsolved murder.
Of course, yeah. We've done a few and we have nothing against doing that.
No, the things that work against us, this is almost 40-year-old case.
Right, yeah.
So maybe not too much in the information area.
You know who this would be good to give to is Cold Justice. I don't know how they get their cases, but I love that show. I think they do a good job. So they do a lot of circumstantial cases. So maybe send that letter to the producers of Cold Justice. It's that show with Kelly Siegler where they work on cold case crimes. And, you know, probably half of them, they get some kind of answers.
Yeah.
At least the ones that they show on TV. But thank you for your note. And I'm very sorry for this. It's really sad that your cousin died that way. So our next email is from Karen.
Karen's a frequent visitor.
Yes.
To us.
We know Karen very well. Karen S. So Karen writes, Jill, I know how much you love Keith Morrison and want to send you this link to East Idaho News Courtroom Insider with Nate Eaton. Coverage for Chad Daybell's trial. His guest tonight, and this is an old email. We just got around to having it on our show. But she writes, his guest tonight was Keith Morrison, and Nate told some wonderfully uplifting stories about Keith. Perhaps you both already saw it, but just in case you didn't. So I have not seen it, but I definitely am going to watch it. Did you watch it?
I watched it.
Yeah.
Today.
So what did we find out about Keith?
We found out that Keith is a pretty laid-back, down-to-earth guy.
Yeah, I can tell that.
And some nice stories. Nate's wife is a podcaster, I think, he said. But she was involved in some project, and Keith read it and said it was a great amount of work. And when they were waiting for Lori's sentencing, Keith wasn't there, but Nate was. And Keith kept texting him every 5 minutes. Is the verdict in yet? Is the verdict in yet?
Well, that's funny. Well, I did watch the trial. I watched the Chad Daybell trial, and Nate Eaton did some great coverage on it.
He certainly did.
And I think Dateline did at least 2 episodes, maybe more, on the Chad Daybell, Lori Vallow case. So, yeah, sounds like those 2 guys bonded.
I think they have.
Yeah.
Couple of bros.
Yeah, which is nice. Okay, so I guess that's it for today, Dickie.
That's it, Jill.
So I'm glad we've had this time together at the Quiet End. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you next time at the Quiet End.
Got plenty of space.
We do. Come on down.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.